professor at the National Defense University and who just published The Politics of Policy Reform, Society Against the State in Post-Soviet Countries. And we will have Colleen Wood, who just came back like mid-March from Bishkek, just before everything closed down, and who is defending very soon her PhD at Columbia University. She's working on state building and identity, and you may know her for many of her articles published in The Diplomats. So I will give the floor to each of them for 15 minutes, and then after we will have a virtual discussion. For that, I will invite you to ask your question in the chat section, or just to say in the chat section that you have a question, and then depending how many questions we have, I will make some selection, give the floor to each of you, or read some of your questions. So please use the chat as a Q&A session. So let's begin. I would like to first welcome Erika Marat. Erika, the floor is yours.
I hope everyone is healthy and safe wherever you are. I'm happy to be part of this conversation today. Let me just remind you that this month is the 10th anniversary of when Kyrgyzstan toppled its last authoritarian regime led by Kiev. You can see the picture from the day on April 7th, 2010. And there was a lot of hope that Kyrgyzstan is truly on the path to greater democratization. So the parliamentary elections in October 2010 were indeed competitive and unpredictable. However, the politics since then continue to be more and more centralized, and incumbent presidents, so Atambayev and now Jeenbekov, trying to sustain their political power. This year, Kyrgyzstan is planning to hold another parliamentary election, but already last year there has been a huge buildup of grassroots mobilization against corruption in the government, and specifically against this one specific personality that exemplifies the vast corruption in the country and his influence in politics in Kyrgyzstan. And this Raimbek Matraimov, former customs control boss, who has allegedly funneled up to $700 million out of Kyrgyzstan because of his involvement in shady deals and corruption and so on. The reason we know about his corruption is from really groundbreaking, unprecedented journalistic investigations that took place in Kyrgyzstan in collaboration between Kyrgyzstan and international journalists. And the more reports of this vast corruption and the connection between this corruption and the current government were surfacing, the more we saw consolidation of young and urban activists in Bishkek, but also across Kyrgyzstan, demanding investigations of corruption, demanding transparency, and demanding a more fair politics. There were several rallies in Kyrgyzstan last winter organized by urban activists again. And it was, in a way, this rising activism that could have, and maybe still will, reshape the course of parliamentary elections this year. There's the pressure, the grassroots pressure on transparency, on representation has been building up. But simultaneously, Jeenbekov, the president, continued to resist calls to investigate corruption. He now notoriously demanded facts to be presented for him to even begin investigations. And what's worse and what really angered many activists is that some journalists and activists began feeling this pressure and intimidation, and even physical intimidation, coming both from state security structures, but also perhaps from affiliates of alleged affiliates of Mitraimov. And one of the notorious cases here is when the founder of a website, factcheck.kg website, that also exposed some corruption around Matraimov's family, Bolot Temirov, he was attacked brutally and beaten in Bishkek, and he thinks that's related to his activity as an activist. So this is the dynamics that we saw before pandemics set in, before pandemics reached Kyrgyzstan, end of last month, mid to end of March. So on the one hand, this rising grassroots activism against corruption, and on the other hand, this really unresponsive state that grew in authoritarianism and wasn't shying away from suppressing and intimidating opponents and those urban activists. So when pandemic reached Kyrgyzstan, and when the government was forced to shut down the country's economy, put everyone on quarantine, the condemnation, the criticism of grassroots activists, urban activists of Jeenbekov's government, they intensified, but now they were mostly focused on how inadequate the state's response to the pandemic has been, how, in what difficult situation all the medical personnel find themselves these days, being really underpaid, undersupplied, not having enough personal protective equipment. And what really angers now many in Kyrgyzstan, and especially those anti-corruption activists, is how when doctors try to speak out against or complain about the conditions in which they work, are also now being forced to stop their complaining and even apologize. So this one doctor specifically has been, and he kind of, his story, his name is Bektur, and his story kind of set off this huge discussion in Kyrgyzstan, that he once complained about the conditions in his hospital and lack of equipment, and that he had to walk a long way to reach his work. But then a few days later, he had to apologize for what he said, and communicate, saying that actually everything is fine and we're okay. So this picture of Bektur became this image of the inadequate state, the state that is unable to provide healthcare and conditions for the doctors, and at the same time now suppresses not only political activists, but even medical personnel that are fighting the pandemic, despite the difficult conditions that they face. So where is Kyrgyzstan right now, given the dynamics before pandemics, and now that the expanding disappointment with the state? I think what's happening now in Kyrgyzstan is really the Jeenbekov's attempts to continue to suppress opponents and suppress voices ahead of parliamentary elections, so that his loyalists and political parties that support his regime are elected into the parliament. And on the other hand, that there was the disappointment with the state, the disillusionment with the state, and the anger about lack of even basic communication about what kind of measures are taken by the government to respond to the pandemic, and especially to people with the most dire conditions who are unable to even find food. This anger in the society is expanding, and for now, the pandemic is helping Jeenbekov to prevent the mass mobilization that is so familiar for Kyrgyzstan from previous political crises. But at some point, there will be a time when those grievances, those bottom-up grievances, will again translate into street politics, frankly, with people rising from various backgrounds now, rising against the decline of economy, inability to access healthcare, and they will join, or they will also contribute to the discussion that has been started by urban activists about this unchecked level of corruption in Kyrgyzstan. So I think COVID pandemic is delaying some of the intensifying dynamics in Kyrgyzstan, but there will be a moment when again we will see this pushback, this bottom-up pushback against the incumbent regime and against the very structure of the Kyrgyzstan's government, demanding that demanding the ouster of the incumbent. Over.
Well, thank you so much, Erica. And now I would like to give the floor to Colleen, who has a wonderful background from Osh.
Yeah, hello from Suleimanto. Great, yeah, thank you so much, Erica, for an interesting background and a kind of discussion of where, what the future of politics looks like. I want to preface my presentation today by pointing out that Kyrgyzstani politics in general are quite unpredictable. And so this pandemic makes forecasting even more difficult than it normally is. So for me, the question that we have framing this event is, how does COVID-19 affect the quality of Kyrgyz democracy? I think the careful optimism of 2018 that followed Jeenbekov's election was more or less shattered in 2019. And as we're watching governments around the world use the pandemic to expand their executive power and restrict individual rights, I think it's very fair to ask the question of how could these dynamics play out in Kyrgyzstan? And at the risk of sounding like a government apologist, I want to talk through the possibility that Kyrgyzstan is actually at lower risk for major autocratic backsliding than other countries. Of course, there's definitely a justified concern about regimes that are using technology infrastructure to monitor and punish those who are breaking quarantine, such as in Kazakhstan, or Turkey, which has used the COVID-19 pandemic as a way to justify laws that are going to try to take control of social media. I think other concerns, such as taking advantage of the shelter-in-place orders or the state of emergency in order to push through trials and push through new laws that might have gotten a big reaction from civil society, is also a concern. But here again, Kazakhstan comes to mind with a new law that's meant to define the appropriate forms of assembly, and also a punitive targeting of some of the activists who were behind Almaty's March 8th Women's Day parade. And I think last, the big concern is that states are going to use the pandemic in order to justify major constitutional reform or legal reform that will give unlimited power to the executive, as the very recent troubling developments in Hungary or even some of the recent reforms in Russia show. And yes, I think some of these concerns are definitely present in Kyrgyzstan. One of the big issues, as Erica mentioned, was the kind of brute force that's been clumsily applied in the treatment of doctors who are trying to speak out about the poor quality of their protective gear, and the public shaming of these doctors who are trying to speak out about their dangerous working conditions is not going to work as a strategy to curate the government's image and to make it look as though the authorities have the crisis under control. And I think Erica is very right to predict that it's only a matter of time for these frustrations to bubble up and translate into street politics. But also I think in Kyrgyzstan, another big issue is that the status of journalists under the state of emergency is still an unresolved question. It honestly wouldn't surprise me to see harsher restrictions placed on journalists who work for outlets that have published critical work in the past, such as Azatuk Club or EurasiaNet. And I'm also concerned about the fact that the outbreak is targeted in rural southern regions where these journalists are not based. This makes it a really big problem for getting accurate reporting about what's happening. And it means that the media's role as a watchdog has been severely undercut. And I think that this puts a bigger reliance on social media to get out information and to find out what's happening, but this also then brings in a risk of accidentally propagating misinformation. As with last week, there was some confusion about whether reports of apartment buildings in Issyk-Kul Oblast were being locked, basically keeping people inside of their homes by brute force. And it turned out that the photo had been from another oblast in Kazakhstan. And so I think the third issue of what this pandemic could do to Kyrgyz politics is the fact that it's, in theory, it's an open-ended crisis. There's no end date, no matter how much politicians and bureaucrats want to kind of have an end date to tell people to calm nerves. But this is actually really dangerous for civil society and protecting the freedom of expression. Even before any cases were identified in Kyrgyzstan, judges were using coronavirus and public health to justify blocking protests, specifically the March 8th Women's Day gathering in Bishkek that was able to proceed in another district within Bishkek, but ended up being violently attacked by a nationalist mob and the police anyway. I think that we could see these types of justifications extending indefinitely in the future. But all of these present an issue in that it's a huge analytical challenge to parse apart what is a genuine public health measure, what is a disingenuous power grab, and what is an opportunistic restriction of civil liberties and dissent. And the issue to me, when I look at Kyrgyz politics, is less the restriction of civil liberties and manipulation of elections, and more about the total collapse of governance and what that means for public trust in the state. And I think in Kyrgyzstan, overburdened governance functions, exacerbated economic challenges, and the way that the bureaucracy is structured between national and local governments make it even more difficult to address the pandemic in an effective way. And one space in where we're seeing this play out is the extent to which healthcare workers are getting sick from COVID-19. That worldwide, the average ratio of healthcare workers who've contracted the disease is about 10% of all countries, of all cases. But in Kyrgyzstan, this number is closer to 20%. And so we see the just totally collapsed healthcare system is having terrible repercussions for the people who are supposed to be at the front lines. I also see that the pandemic is going to exacerbate rural-urban inequalities in Kyrgyzstan. And I think the fact that it's playing out in rural southern districts in Jalalabad Oblast that are already quite cut off from the center makes it even more difficult to address the pandemic head-on. Moreover, Kyrgyzstan has not exactly been the most economically secure country. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the most remittance-dependent economies in the world. And of course, the pandemic has brought major economic downturn across the world, including here in the United States. But it's fair to say that Kyrgyzstan is going to be hit especially hard as a result of the pandemic, that Kyrgyzstan's economy is going to be hit hard because of the pandemic. And this is going to take years to overcome. And I think rather than focusing on the regime trying to take advantage of the coronavirus to do some sort of a practice run of sorts for more dictatorial policies, I think we should be concerned that the issues that had been on the national agenda before the crisis, those that Erica outlined, that these issues don't get wiped away, especially because the social and political issues that we're facing Kyrgyzstan didn't magically disappear because of coronavirus. And if anything, they've only been magnified as a result of the pandemic. And there's three that I want to outline here before I'll end my presentation. So the first issue is violence against women. So I was in Bishkek up until the middle of March and was there to observe the march that took place on March 8th. And the issues that these women were trying to bring to light, the scope of violence against women, of domestic violence, and the treatment of women in Kyrgyz society, the way that it was put down violently by men in masks and by busloads of police officers waiting nearby to watch this unfold, only shows the extent to which the gender cleavage is a really, really powerful issue in Kyrgyz society, and one that is not going to go away. In fact, has been magnified as a result of COVID, that there are a handful of politicians in parliament who've been trying to draw attention to the rise in reported domestic violence following orders to shelter in place. They've been ignored, but they're trying really hard to create exceptions to the shelter in place rules and the quarantine rules to help women who are in violent homes be able to leave. The second issue is related to what Erica was talking with the role that media plays in Kyrgyz politics. And I'm concerned about the use of ambiguous legal categories. And in the past, this has been hooliganism and inciting ethnic hatred as charges that are used to silence dissent. These are used in tandem with targeted defamation lawsuits against journalists. And we could see with the open-ended public health crisis that someone leaving quarantine could be an additional way to target journalists. And, you know, Erica brought up the Marat family, and I think it's important to note here that they've donated huge sums of money to the fund to fight coronavirus, like millions and millions of soms. And I think you could naively interpret this as a genuine effort to give back, or I think more accurately, an attempt at reputation laundering. But these people have also not given up their fight to silence those who brought to light the extent of their corruption and theft from the Kyrgyz government, and simply donating some of what they stole back to the state in an effort to address the coronavirus pandemic is really not going to help. So I'm optimistic about the role of local media to continue to push back against these forces. And last is the issue of elections. So there were supposed to be local parliamentary elections in early April, which were postponed indefinitely. And whenever these elections can be rescheduled, I think that we should expect huge scale vote buying and other clientelistic practices as a way to ensure seats. This is both because the stakes for local elections are even higher now that the playing field for national parliamentary elections is so fresh, with the kind of dissolution of the SDP ruling party. There's not a clear front runner for which parties are going to dominate in the November national parliamentary elections. But the second reason that this type of corrupt clientelistic elections should be expected is because of the economic troubles that are going to be coming from the total like shuttering of the global economy and the trickle-down effect through migrant laborers and Kyrgyzstan's agricultural industry. So when I think what all of this is to say that when you take a very zoomed in look at Kyrgyzstani politics and governance, the state of emergency and the way that the government is handling Corona makes it look like a total nightmare. That everything is going poorly, nothing is working. And I think to a certain extent that's a fair conclusion. But I also wonder whether taking a bit of a broader comparative frame helps put these worrying trends and worrying observations in a bit of perspective. Right now, I think as analysts, our job should be to take steps to parse out what exactly can be attributed to the learning curve of just trying to handle a totally unprecedented public health and economic crisis versus what state behavior should and must be resisted. This is a difficult task, but a necessary one, and it's right now our job as analysts to do that. So thank you for your time. Look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Colleen, for this really great presentation. There have been already a lot of questions. I invite people to continue asking questions in the chat section. There is also a little button to raise your hand if you want to be given the floor. But let's begin with the question. There was at least 2 questions on the remittances and the migrant issue. So can we see kind of return of migrants from Russia, and what about the reduction of remittances and how it's impacting the situation in Kyrgyzstan? So I would propose to join these 2 questions into one first to begin with, and to give you the floor.
Mm-hmm. So regarding remittances, there have been some reports about migrants returning or not being allowed to enter Russia and then returning to Kyrgyzstan. I think at this point now that we're entering the warm season, at this point, the question is how many are not going to go to Russia or Kazakhstan for seasonal labor. And there will absolutely be a decline in remittances, and it's probably going to be very much felt in the population. One thing I do want to say is the migrants who are in Russia right now, and even though there has been a considerable slowdown of the economy in Russia as well, and shutting down of construction sites in Russia, where most migrants tend to work, there is still what we've learned from 2008 financial crisis is migrants would still prefer to be in Russia and to scrape whatever is available in Russia, because the situation back at home is even worse. So at least they will send less, but they will send something, as opposed to sitting out the crisis back in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan or Uzbekistan for that matter.
Colleen? Yeah, all of that resonates. I think that I'll add to is that unlike previous economic crises, 2008, 2014, where the price of oil dropped and kind of sent out this trickle-down effect through remittances to affect Kyrgyzstan's economy, is that what's different here is just the kind of global shutdown of borders, which I think took a lot of people by surprise, that there were reports from airports in Moscow of groups of dozens to 100 migrant laborers who were trying to get back to Kyrgyzstan, and flight after flight was canceled, basically locking these people in limbo in an airport. Leaving the airport meant that they would have to go into quarantine in Russia, but not leaving the airport meant that they were paying more and more money to try to get on flights that don't really exist. And I think that the issue for migrant laborers who are stuck in Russia, but also there have been reports coming out from Turkey of migrants who work in hotel towns, and just a total shutdown of tourism means that they don't have jobs there. But so the value of migrant laborers' earnings has dropped. But what's also concerning is that shelter-in-place laws in the countries where these people are working mean that migrants are either out of work or are going to work in even more precarious conditions than before, as evidenced by the death of a Kyrgyz laborer in a fire that broke out in a hospital that they were building for COVID patients. So I think we should also be looking out for the rights and safety of migrants who are stuck, let alone the money that they are or aren't going to be able to send back home.
Great. I see a second set of questions that is more looking at the domestic political situation, about the causes of failure for last summer kind of uprising or tensions, the issues of regional tensions north and south, and can we say that urban activism is mostly a Bishkek-centered atmosphere, or do we also see this thriving urban activism in the south? So this kind of north-south split and the kind of general riot or street revolution oriented atmosphere. So if you could also address these questions. Erica?
So the recent mobilization of, frankly, educated middle class in Bishkek is something new for Kyrgyzstan. It's a new type of activism that hasn't been present before. So it's not chaperoned by NGOs or people affiliated with NGOs. It is really an initiative of a few individuals that resonated with many urban dwellers. They have supporters around the country, and including in Osh and Jalalabad, but they're not as numerous. they share the sentiments, but they're not as numerous, and they're not able to join protests as easily as people in Bishkek because of just political conditions. In Osh, it's a little more, it is a more, under the local government, it's a bit more controlled political environment. And even so, there have been people who showed their support. So in Osh or Karakol, in Talas, showed their support when large protests convened in Bishkek. And I know that, again, before the pandemic, there were huge ambitions among Bishkek-based activists to actually reach out to like-minders across the country, partly in preparation for parliamentary elections this fall.
Yeah, and I think I'll add on this question of like the regional tensions between North and South is troubling activity I've seen on social media of a lot of blame for the crisis in Kyrgyzstan towards Southerners. That the way that the virus was found to be brought into Kyrgyzstan was a group of men who'd come back from Hajj to their trip to Mecca, and upon getting back to Kyrgyzstan through a massive party, as is per custom, at which hundreds, if not thousands, of people were exposed. And this all came out of the Suzak district in Jalalabad Oblast. And so seeing the kind of repeated north-south, like borderline xenophobic comments and like the development of discourse about who is to blame for coronavirus, I think is something to keep a pulse on, that it's a worrying narrative development.
Good. I see another set of question about external support to the rise of autocracy, the Chinese influence, the Russian influence, or something more about the role of external actors, and especially Russia and China, in reinforcing authoritarian tendencies in Kyrgyzstan.
It obviously doesn't help to be surrounded by authoritarian countries, but I would give credit just to local forces, to the local structures that allow expansion of authoritarianism. What we saw following after April 2010 is that otherwise, so a group of otherwise disconnected political opponents to Bakiyev's regime, they decided to set up a system in which they would compete on the same ground and then call it a parliamentary system. And for a few years, it did work out because parliamentary elections were unpredictable, and people who were elected into parliament try to genuinely represent their constituency. I mean, sometimes it was not in a too democratic or articulate way, but they tried. But over time, it began with Atambayev, who decided to promote a protege to succeed him, perhaps in hopes that he will continue to play a central political role. But then Jeenbekov, when elected, was not happy with how Atambayev continued to intervene in politics, and the two men quickly grew apart, and now we know that Atambayev is in detention awaiting his trial. And but it showed that the system that was put in place after 2010, it could also be undermined by a president, and that's exactly what's happening right now. That Jeenbekov perhaps, in fact, is looking to switch the system. We don't know yet, but there are some signs that he will try to change the constitution to make it a presidential republic again, just to consolidate his powers, perhaps beyond his 6-year one term that is allowed. And it is happening as we speak now, as the pandemic is raging in Kyrgyzstan and the region and the world. So there are these concerns as well.
And I think to the point of the question I was asking about what kind of the geopolitical influence is here on Kyrgyz domestic politics, is what has been most interesting to me is the fact of how quickly Chinese investment in Kyrgyzstan's economy dried up in the face of the pandemic. That in the span of a month, Chinese investment in the region shrank by a huge amount. And I think that this shows how kind of fragile the One Belt, One Road investment in Kyrgyzstan is, which is probably largely due to China's needing to focus on its own internal issues and handling the pandemic within its own country, but also because over the last 2 years, there's been really vocal criticism of the relationship that Kyrgyzstan has been developing with China on these economic issues. So I think of the question of to what extent can outside powers also take advantage of the pandemic in order to help Kyrgyzstan consolidate into a more effective autocracy. I don't foresee that happening in the next few months.
Okay, I see too there are several questions on the pandemics and the public health system, but before that I would like to go back on one of the other questions that is linked to what you were discussing about the public reaction to the proposal of a constitutional referendum in October. So if you could a little bit more comment on that specific aspect, and then probably after we will move to the questions that are more about public health issues.
Sure. So the proposal came in. This is the copy of this proposal. It came on April 1st, so the Fool's Day, and for some time there was a confusion whether the parliamentarian who proposed it was joking, or in fact this was the case, that he wants to change the system into parliamentary or presidential republic. And it came out of nowhere, really. There were no discussions about the need to transform the very structure of the Kyrgyz Republic, of the statehood, because that's what the proposal says. And the immediate reaction of the public was, well, there's something else in the play here. Perhaps that parliamentarian is just voicing what the incumbent wants, the president wants to do, and they're using this public confusion and this, distraction on pandemic, the everyday distraction of pandemic, to fulfill some of their bigger political ambitions going forward, knowing that there perhaps won't be protests on the streets, at least in the foreseeable future, and that it will be possible to just get it through the system to be able to change the parliamentary, or change the political system in Kyrgyzstan again.
Yeah, and I think just to add, what's been interesting about Jeenbekov is that even though he was kind of chosen to be a protege by Atambayev, and their relationship quickly soured, it hasn't seemed that Jeenbekov has been very productive at himself trying to rein in and control power for himself. In the face of the last 6 months worth of pretty big crises, public discourse has been, where is Jeenbekov? What is he doing? Why isn't he saying anything? That this was the case with the first round of Reakция protests back in November. It was the case with the Feminal protests in late November, early December. And it's again the case with the coronavirus pandemic. In the first few weeks before cases had been announced in Kyrgyzstan, I think a lot of people were looking to the president to stand up and draw attention to himself, to be a leader for society, and he really has not done that. I think it's interesting that a few days ago, perhaps in direct response to this proposal for the constitutional referendum, Jeenbekov himself is making statements about trying to preserve and strengthen Kyrgyzstan's parliamentary system. So I think here we might be seeing what's more of a mismatch, that you might, the person who wrote the proposal might be trying to anticipate the results of the November election, recognizing that there is not a clear party leader that's expected to dominate, and seeing that as an opportunity to give more power to the president, but it doesn't seem like Jeenbekov is super eager to take that opportunity.
Great. Let's now move. So there are, of course, a lot of questions about the pandemics itself and the reaction of the state of the public health system. But before that, there was a set of questions about the Kyrgyzstan receiving international aid for the pandemics and also economically, and Kyrgyzstan being the first country to receive coronavirus financing from the IMF. So if you could address this kind of international aspect, and then we will move more on the kind of domestic public health aspect.
So against the general ineffectiveness of the state, we can see how what is considered to be, or what is commonly referred to as foreign agents in post-Soviet reality, are now actually kicking in and are the ones who are driving help and support efforts in Kyrgyzstan. I think international NGOs present in Kyrgyzstan, but also organizations like IMF and foreign governments, including China and Uzbekistan, are stepping in to provide support to the medical system in Kyrgyzstan, to economy in Kyrgyzstan. One other important aspect I want to point at is that the migrant diaspora of Kyrgyzstan also stepped in, mostly in Western countries, residing in Western countries, are now collecting tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars and trying to support the medical personnel or people with really precarious economic conditions outside of government efforts, distrusting government efforts and outside of government efforts. And all that is showing that despite the rhetoric that existed in Kyrgyzstan up until now about the foreign intervention, Western intervention, or migrants being really those people who abandoned their country, these are now the sources of strength and support in the society, and it's something that the government will have to acknowledge at some point, I think.
Yeah, and I think that the need for the government to acknowledge this ties into the issue that we brought up about the doctor who had spoken out about poor conditions, being forced to apologize and admit that he had been spreading misinformation, that no, everything is perfect, our healthcare system is great, that this attempt to cultivate an image of society that's totally different from what everyone recognizes it to be is only counterproductive. So there's a lot of kind of clever memes that are making fun of the state. When the first batch of aid from USAID was coming in, the first batch of masks and PPE that was sent in from the US and from China, this kind of tongue-in-cheek take of where is Kyrgyzstan now that the West is helping our society. And I think there's a new batch of meme discourse that's been developing around this issue as well, of course there's no aid because everything in our country is perfect, we're fully developed, and there's nothing wrong with our economy or our healthcare system. So I think the impulse of the state to try to look like it's in control makes sense, but is also counterproductive, that everyone knows that things are not perfect, are not functioning super well. But moving forward beyond this tongue-in-cheek initial reaction, I hope that both media and the kind of well-educated people who've been putting pressure on the regime through the Reakция protests also try to put pressure to make sure that this huge flow of aid coming in from the West and from international organizations is distributed as it should, is not skimmed from, and actually makes it to the regions of the country that are struggling with the pandemic the most.
Great. So there was a lot of questions about the public health, the healthcare system globally. You already mentioned several of these elements, but also if you could comment more on that, the kind of healthcare as the social contract and how the society is reacting to the kind of failure of the healthcare system. Is that creating this impression that the state is unable to perform duties, or is that on the contrary seen like it should be a collective effort? So you already address that in several aspects, but if you could come back to that, there was several questions related to this kind of healthcare system and the way people are reacting, and maybe if you have some more precise information on the situation on the ground, the kind of medical equipment that is needed. What do we know about, how people can deal with the lack of furniture and equipment?
Yeah, I can start on this. That I think this question of whether it's specifically the COVID pandemic that is causing a lack of public trust in the ability of the state to provide public health, that this isn't a new suspicion or like a new source of mistrust, that the healthcare system in Kyrgyzstan has long struggled, and it's not just COVID that's putting undue pressure on it. I think of friends and host families who have given birth to babies in the last 5 years since I've been spending lots of time living in Kyrgyzstan, and the amount of extra money and supplies that they personally had to bring in order to give birth in a state hospital, and the way that they talked about their treatment, that then reflects the fact that distrust in the state provided health is not brand new. But I think to the question of what is the gap between needed medical equipment and that infrastructure that exists, photographs coming out from Suzak district, from Jalalabad city are showing nurses and doctors who are wearing garbage bags, who that the only water that they have to be washing hands is in buckets that have been gathered and walked from outside into the building. And I think what's telling about this is that people are very rightfully upset and frustrated with the inability of the state to provide for them. But very similar pictures are coming out of New York City as well. So trying to put this into context of what was a pre-existing inadequacy of the Kyrgyz system versus what is something that's being faced worldwide right now is hard to gauge.
Erica, would you like to add something on that?
Sure. I completely agree with Colleen what she said, that it seems like it's a global picture, and some countries are affected more than others in terms of how much doctors are protected and feel supported. But I think what really concerns a lot in Kyrgyzstan is how the government now moved on to shut down complaints from doctors. And one thing is to marginalize political activists or political opposition. We've kind of seen that, we're accustomed to that. But suppressing doctors is something new. And I think the government did a lot of harm in its fight against the pandemic by forcing this one doctor to, who now became kind of a symbol of the weak, unsupported medical system and the state that only cares for its image and its power to control its control. So I think it contributed to the grievances and distrust of the government in general. And many people now realize that whatever support doctors receive are generated by private funds, by international organizations, by diaspora, but not so much by the government.
I think just one last point that maybe ties this question of what medical equipment exists in the country, but also ties this back to the geopolitical question, is that Turkey has in the last several years tried to really step up in providing aid, both especially in the form of education and medical services. That there was already a big hospital built in Bishkek by the Turkish state, and more money was given to build a special clinic just for coronavirus cases. But for several weeks now, the clinic has been standing, but for some reason has not started working. So I think here we see this effort of other governments maybe trying to have a PR gain or trying to assert themselves as being kind of the most natural ally of Kyrgyzstan, but not really being able to follow through on those commitments and not actually being able to offer meaningful aid.
And to follow on that, there was a question on Kyrgyz foreign policy and the new US policy, the C5+1 initiatives and the access to the US Fund for Regional Development. So do you see that being discussed inside the Kyrgyz public opinion, this kind of US role, or do we see more globally as everywhere else a kind of disappearance of US leadership around the crisis?
I think, oh, go for it. Go for it.
No, go, please, please.
I just say that I think the C5+1 has been interesting, and I think probably the reason that we haven't heard tons about it in the public sphere is that even from the American angle, it just seems like a last-ditch effort to reassert that the US matters and is also trying to have an influence in Central Asia in addition to China and Russia. I think that the corona crisis doesn't really change C5+1, and that even like the C5+1 as an alternate to either the new EU strategy or to China trying to get in with One Belt, One Road really doesn't do much to dramatically reshape the like structure of like multi-vector diplomacy in Central Asia. I think if anything, it just reflects that everyone is still invested in this as the way that things are working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think most countries in the region are now frankly looking at China's support with equipment and doctors. So Kazakhstan is one example. Test kits and so on. The news of the new policy, the White House policy, didn't even quite trend in Central Asia. I did not see any major discussions. Probably, perhaps, there's nothing groundbreaking in it. No significant changes in approaches, or anything of that sort.
And maybe for the last round of question about the accountability of foreign aid distribution, the role that civil society can play, how to make medical aid more transparent, what are the risks of corruption of medical equipment. So if you also have some impression on how the civil society is prepared to react to the fact that medical equipment are now becoming kind of hard currencies that have a huge values.
Yeah. I mean, there were reports about some medical equipment. I can't remember who was the donor, but being resold in Bishkek. But it is definitely a problem that there could be corruption schemes arising from supplies of medical equipment, and most of that can be related to how the Ministry of Health functions in Kyrgyzstan, whether they decide to monopolize how this equipment is distributed. I think at this point, it hasn't been the primary concern. The primary concern has been more about how governments allocated support of small and medium-sized businesses is being distributed, or is it actually being distributed? Regarding medical equipment, there were no major scandals, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do arise. And for international donors, it always helps to work with local trusted NGOs or directly with hospitals.
And I think I'll just add on this question about like civil society as a mechanism for accountability is that the biggest challenge right now is that the orders to shelter in place means that journalists tend to be centered in Bishkek, and if they can't leave their apartment, let alone their neighborhood, how are they supposed to be traveling around the country to be observing and reporting on malpractice that's happening in rural districts in Jalalabad? So I think that this puts a lot of pressure on maybe like local journalists, but the quality is perhaps not as high. So I think civil society might struggle to like follow through on its watchdog tasks just because of the way that information kind of requires traveling about Kyrgyzstan, and that it's going to be harder to monitor and convincingly report that these things are happening.
Right, and maybe the last question about the smartization of cities and how street surveillance and artificial intelligence can be used in the current crisis context, and the potential role of security services in trying to kind of take that opportunity to build more on their power. So I know it's something Erika has been working on, and Colleen, you probably also would have to add. So that would be our last question.
So when it comes to Kyrgyzstan, there isn't much to report. Of course, there are facial recognition cameras. There's traffic cameras now in Bishkek and some major highways, but they're not as widespread as in Kazakhstan and Russia. And those two countries are really openly leading and declaring how they are retooling their electronic surveillance infrastructure that was originally built for public order, anti-criminal activities, now being retooled to use to detain violators of quarantine measures or shelter-in-place measures. It's not really a story of Kyrgyzstan. What is a story of Kyrgyzstan is this old and familiar ways of how some law enforcement officials who need to enforce quarantine measures are perhaps maybe looking for opportunities for bribes and enforcing the measures against some populations rather than others, and so on, but not so much electronic surveillance, at least not that we are aware of at this point.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And maybe just to add like an illustrative example of that is that just a few days ago, reports came out that a police officer had stopped a schoolgirl and told her that the fine for being out under the state of emergency was 35,000 som, but she could pay 5,000 som to get away with it. That I think that this type of brute force of like bothering individual people, mistreating them at the checkpoints, that this is what is the bigger immediate concern. I think also it's telling that almost immediately people know that this has happened, are reporting about it on social media, or CLOP also has an open document that people can be submitting examples of this in the regions outside of Bishkek. So people are watching and are reporting that this corruption is happening, and I think are not afraid to report on the police, which is good.
Well, great. Well, with that optimistic note, I think it's time for us to conclude. We will have only virtual upload, unfortunately, but I think the fact that we have more than 100 participants just give you an idea on how the seminar was successful. And I think everybody is really interested in following what is happening in the region. And you both had really great, give us great analytical insight on what was happening. So thank you so much. And for our participants, let me just tell you what is coming next. On April 23rd, we will have a discussion on state custom and Sharia in post-war Chechnya. And on April 27th, we will have a seminar looking at what is happening in Tajikistan, also in terms of political regime and election. So please stay in touch with us through this virtual webinar. And once again, thank you, Erica and Colleen. And please, everybody, stay well and safe and cozy at home. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.